emerging economies and power shifts. So, as usual, give you feedback on your feedback from last week. So the last lecture was given average rate from your side 4.6 out of 5, which is a massive jump from the lecture before, which was 4.2. But when I look at the feedback from your side, I find out that only a few people, really many people, didn't read the lecture. So I would assume that those who didn't read the lecture, they were happy, super happy with the lecture, or super disappointed from the lecture. So it could go either way. So anyway, so let's just move on to the usual activities. So please log on Socrative and enter the room number, echo swans, and answer the first 3 questions. Okay? If you have any problems logging on Socrative, please let me know. Okay, so as a brief summary of what we covered last week, we talked about American economic power, and we gave some sort of economic history of how the American economy was, how it looked like in 19th century, and how it was basically based on agriculture sector. And then moving toward the 19th century, we start seeing the rise of the US economy as a superpower, and at the same time the decline of Britain as a superpower at that point. Then we ended the lecture by looking at what we call Trumponomics. I asked you to do some readings around this, and we'll talk about this in the seminar. We'll discuss this further in the seminar today, by the way. Okay, so there are no seminars tomorrow. It's only an extra lecture today at 5 o'clock. Please check your timetable, and I think it should be in the same room here. Okay, so what we're going to do today then? So we basically want to see some examples of emerging economies and how or whether the rising of powers like China, Brazil, India, Russia can cause some global shift in power globally or not. So this is something to understand. We need first to understand what is economic development, how for a country how to grow, and when we can say this is a developing country or this is an emerging economy, how can we measure this? This is something that we will learn first. We'll learn about first, and then we'll look at some examples, and basically we'll look at Brics countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and we'll discuss why they are important, where this term comes from, Brics, and then we will look at how the hypothesis or the convergence hypothesis, what it proposes and what it means, and whether this will lead to a global or a global power shift or not. So these are the topics we hopefully, or the points hopefully we will be able to cover today. So this is the readings. These are the readings for this topic, and there's one paper, important paper here, 2007. Please make sure you read this paper. In the seminar today, we will discuss why or what could make a nation superpower, and whether the US today is a superpower or is the world's superpower or not, and most importantly, or more importantly, whether this will continue to be the case in the future or not. Because today we'll be talking about global power shifts, and many observers, many economists, many politicians would think that, or would argue that there is some sort of a shift of power globally from the West to the East toward China, Russia, and other Brics countries or other developing or emerging economies. We'll see more about this today in the lecture and in the seminar as well. Another question I would like to discuss with you today as well in the seminar is the US massive spending on defense justifiable or not. We probably will see that how the US defense budget is probably the biggest in history. So why is that? Is it something that could be justified or not? okay? So we'll discuss this further in the seminar. So let's move to the first point we want to cover today, which is economic development. You probably have heard this before. You might have done economic development module last year, or you probably have heard this many times in the news. So that's why I just will go briefly on the concept, what economic development means, and then we'll move on to emerging economies. As I said, we will discuss a specific example. We look at Brics countries. So until the Second World War, industrialization was the main object, national objective. So basically, there was no talk or discussion about development or international assistance. So mainly, each country was more concerned about how to change the economy or the structure of the economy from being based on agriculture to become more industrialized economy. And because in the past we've seen how even with the US, we just said that now, the US in the 19th century was mainly an economy that is based on agriculture sector, but when moving toward the 20th century, it became more industrialized and it became a superpower. So after the Second World War, and I think that is the important point here for the discussion on economic development, when more countries became independent, then development or economic development became a central issue in the global economy. So this is a map. This is this is Africa, and if you look carefully at this map, you will see most countries here probably they gained their independence 1960. So a few years after the Second World War, and that would explain probably why economic development was not an important issue before the Second World War, but as more countries became independent, then economic development became a central issue in the global economy. So I think this is more clear. So this is the same map, but if you look at this color here, 1960. So most of Africa basically became independent after 1960. Okay, so that might explain why economic development became a central issue in the global economy after the second, not before the Second World War, after the Second World War. Okay, so the question now, so why development? Why we are concerned about economic development? One reason could be fighting global poverty, and I think as usual, when you see these buttons here, so when you click here, it will take you to some further readings to do. So please make sure you click in these buttons here to read more and to see this poverty clock, which basically show you the number of people who live in extreme poverty in the world. And it's the nice thing about this, it shows you the projection of this number to 2030. So looking at the graph we have here, you'll see this is the number in billions. So this is number of people in absolute poverty. You see how this is declining over the years. So this is 1981 till 2016. So basically, that's why we study economic development. That's why economic development is important. So one reason economic development became a very important, a very central issue in the global economy is to fight extreme poverty. Another issue could be related to inequality. Inequality is another important issue. And what you see here in the map is the top 10% national income share across the world in 2016. So that explains to you how inequality is a massive issue, is a very important issue. And I think we touched it up on this point in the first lecture when we give an overview of the global economy when we introduce this module. So there are different reasons to study economic development. So I'll just move on. But the question is how to develop. That's the important question. So if you believe that development is important, it's something that we need to learn about, it's something that we need to study, it's something that we need to understand, then the question comes then, well, if I'm a poor country, if I'm a developing country, then how to develop? How to develop, there's no consensus on methods or strategies. So it's a very difficult question. And that's why you see there's no like direction, especially when it comes to economists. So all economists will tell you, well, it depends, and they give you some conditions and then give you some sort of outcomes. But if these conditions change, then we probably will have different outcomes. So the bottom line here is that there are no consensus, or there's no consensus on methods or strategies, and even the term itself, the term economic development, is even difficult to define in an easy way. So what I want you to do now, just go on the platform, and as we usually do it, just tell me what you think when you hear the term economic development. What is the first thing come to your mind? Okay, so how would you think? I don't want you to give me a formal definition of what economic development, because as we already said now, it's very difficult to define. It's not an easy thing to define. But what I want you to do, what I'm interested in, is to tell me what is the first thing come to your mind when you hear the word economic development, or this term. So what does it mean to you? Okay, so let's just look at what we think about development. As we said, economic development, there is no clear-cut definition of the term development. So what development means or even requires, so there's no consensus on that. But what everyone would agree on is that it means improving the economic well-being and the quality of life of a nation. So that is the bottom line. That's what we want to do. But the question here is, development different from growth? Is it enough for a country to be growing in order to say, well, this country is developing or not? And this is a very important question. China, as we will see later, the Chinese economy is growing so fast, and even most emerging economies, as we'll see later, develop faster than advanced economy. Enough? Is that something that we could rely on to say, well, they're growing, is a magnificent, this is a really good growth rate, so we could say, well, these economies are developing. So basically, development is probably, you will see, is different from economic, is just growing. So development is more about the process. It's more about like a continuous process, how to change the structure of the economy in such a way that you improve the well-being of the people in this economy. So even when you grow as an economy, so who actually receive the gains from this growth? Okay, so is it the majority, or is it only a few people? So it is very important not just to ask the question of growth, it has to be continuous as well. So this growth doesn't have, or if it happens only once, whether this will be a sign or will denote economic development or not, this is again is not enough. So growing in itself, well, growth is good, it's not bad, there's nothing wrong about economic growth, but as I said, growth in itself or alone is not sufficient. It has to be a continuous process, and the main purpose of this process is transforming a society to achieve self-sustained growth. So growing one doesn't mean that you are developing. It has to be sustained, self-sustained growth, and it will be also an ongoing process that not just in economic terms, you need also to think about social and political changes. So the question now, how can we do this? How can we measure economic development? Okay, so if we understand now, economic development is not an easy term to define. It requires transforming a society in different ways, and it entails, or it has different dimensions, economic, social, and political dimensions. So then how can we measure it? How can we measure it in a quantitative way? So we can make comparisons between countries, we can make a conclusion over time whether a certain economy is developing or not. The way we understand development, the way you define economic development, it will reflect on how we measure it. So in the past, the focus mainly was on economic variables. So if an economy is growing, so that would be enough. So economic growth was the most important factor. It was even important more than equality. So initially, inequality or redistribution wasn't really an important issue. It was a second order concern. Why? Because according to Kuznets curve, which takes the inverted U shape, in the beginning, in the early stage of economic development, you'll see income per capita increasing, but at the same time, inequality increase. But at some point, at a later stage in development, you will see that as a country develops and its income per capita increases, inequality will drop. But how that happened? It's because of what they call the trickle-down effect. So first, when rich gain more wealth, then they will invest more, they will spend more. That means they will create jobs, they will pay more taxes, and this, through their spending as well, that will create more jobs and boost the economy. So that was the idea. So if in the beginning, that's fine to make people, the wealthy people, to make them wealthier, that's okay, because over time, as you progress, you will see, or at later stages in development, you will see that inequality will drop again. Okay, and again, that's what they call the trickle-down effect. So if development can be measured through growth, then we can actually use the GDP as a measure of growth, because GDP, or gross domestic product, and I'm sure you all know what the gross domestic product is, but it's the value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a specific time period, usually a year, or could be measured quarterly as well. So in that case, it's a very easy way to measure development. Then it's very easy because GDP measures the overall economic performance. It's very easy to understand, very easy to measure, and also you can use to make a meaningful cross-country comparison. So it's very straightforward. Okay, if you can measure the GDP, we do, so that's fine. So we can measure how a country is developing. So this is an example. This data is 2017 from the World Bank database. It shows you the top 10 countries by GDP in 2017. Look at where China is. This is the GDP in constant prices 2011. So the Chinese economy in terms of the GDP, well, it's even larger than the USA. I think when I told this last year and the year before, we were talking about how the Chinese economy is growing fast, and it is expected that it will outperform the US economy. Well, today we'll see that actually it's larger than the US economy. So these are the top 10. So in that case, we would say, well, China is a growing economy. China is, you can say, well, it's doing very well now, because given that if we measure economic development through the size of the GDP, then, well, it's doing very, very well. So using the same measure, or looking at growth rather than in absolute terms, we can look at African countries. This graph shows you the growth rate, the annual growth rate of African countries. Then you can rate these countries. You can see which countries are doing better than other countries. So the top African countries by growth, GDP growth. So if the idea is just GDP, so it's very straightforward. So we have data on GDP, and we can just make all these comparisons. But is this enough? That's the question. Is it enough to look at the GDP as a measure of development? I see people saying no. Yeah, of course it's not enough. Okay, because we said it's not just growing. That is the problem. So what sort of growth you have? Okay, that's very important. So if you think about just GDP growth, well, just to emphasize, GDP growth is not bad. Growth is good. okay? But growth is not enough. We need more than that for development. So GDP in itself is a very poor indicator of development. Why? Because it's too restrictive. It actually ignores other aspects. It look only at economics, and even not just all economics. It look at one aspect, like how much we produce, but what sort of growth we have. Is it shared among the majority in the society, or it is just for few? Again, this is something the GDP doesn't reflect. So it doesn't reflect equality, it doesn't reflect health, it doesn't reflect what sort of or the society's well-being as well. So that's why the other measures were developed to reflect the economic development, like Human Development Index. Human Development Index was introduced in 1990, and given that the real wealth of any nation is its people, so, and the purpose or the ultimate goal of the economic development is to create an enabling environment for the people to enjoy long, healthy, creative life, then these are the aspects we can include, and that's what exactly the HDI includes. So it includes life expectancy and education and income. So the idea here is not just income. So you look at life expectancy, education, so the sort of human capital in that country. So, and that would probably give you a bigger picture, a wider picture than GDP. Just remember, when you look at GDP, remember the top 10 countries? We saw China, USA. Now let's look at the HDI. So which countries we see? Where's USA? It's number 5. USA is not number 2. Where's China? Is it there? It's not there. You see, so that is the idea. So when you look at just growth is not enough. It's not reflecting development. So development is much more complicated. It's much more wider than just economic growth. But anyway, and again, even if you look at African countries, it's the same idea. So you see how this is the bottom here. Like this is the ranking, and this is the so this is the first Norway, first Australia, second, and etc. according to HDI, okay, Human Development Index. Anyway, so this is just to show you that growth in itself, well, growth is good, but growth in itself is not enough, okay, to measure development. Okay, so now what we agree on, well, there's nothing to agree on because there's no consensus exists on how to measure development. We saw that HDI is just another attempt to measure economic development in a different way, not just by relying on economic growth or GDP growth. But what we agree on now is that, well, economic growth in itself is not enough. We need to think of other social and cultural variables as well when it comes to development. Okay, so now we know how to measure, or at least we understand what is development. We can try to measure it in different ways. We looked at just 2 ways, GDP and HDI. Then, well, a natural question would ask ourselves, why developing countries or why poor countries are poor? So that's a very important question, because if we know why they are poor, then we can know how to develop. So if we know the reasons why we are poor, why we are not developed country, why we are not a developed country, then we can figure out how to develop. So you'll see like there are different reasons why a given country is underdeveloped. So as you said, I think one of the main reasons I can see here, like corruption, inequality. I'm just reading your answers, conflicts, etc. So if you want to summarize all the reasons we give here, all the factors that you think are behind underdevelopment, you probably will see that some of them are internal factors, some of them are external factors. It could be a combination of both. So if it's something related to institutional setup, for example, in a country. It could be because of corruption, or it could be because of any other institutional factor. Then, well, it is related to that economy, and then this is where we need to start. Some people, and I think we studied dependency theory, and we saw how some theorists or some people would argue that there are external forces that prevent developing countries from being developed, and all these ideas are based on the idea of exploitation, etc. And I think we already covered that when we talked about dependency theory. So I'm not saying these are the factors, but I'm saying whatever factor you think of, it probably would come under one of these factors. Is it something related to the country or the way the economy is structured, or it is something related to the global economy and external forces? But again, wherever you probably be thinking of, it will be related to one of these causes. So let's move on to the important point then. So if now we understand what is economic development, how to measure economic development, we understand all the difficulties in capturing this concept, but we can actually observe some of the developing countries, some of the emerging countries, and see how they are doing. So, and as I said, I will focus mainly on Brics countries. Why? Because Brics countries, well, by the way, Brics again refer to Brazil, Russia, India, China. Some people like to add to BRIC, make this S, small s, to be capital to become Brics, so they add South Africa. So if you add South Africa, this small s will become capital S, then it becomes Brics. So whatever, it's not is the way you look at it is fine. So if you wanna group them into include South Africa as well, so it's not a problem. But the point here is that how over the last 3 decades, how these a group of countries are growing so fast, are doing very well in economic terms, and that's why they draw the attention. And how they're growing. And as I said in the beginning, even some people would argue that there will be a power shift toward these countries, and I will see more about this in a minute. So that's why it is important to understand how these BRICS, or why these BRICS are important today, why people think about them. I'll give them this importance. So basically, if you look at BRICS themselves as a group of countries, they have little in common. So if you think about culture, alliances, background, language, economic structures, they're very different. So, I mean, if you look at Europe, when you look at the European Union, at least there are so many things in common. But when you look at BRICS, so they don't even exist in the same region as well. So there's literally in common between these countries, but most importantly, or the most important factor, is trade relation. So the main factor, or the main factor that brings these countries together, is international trade, and that's why they gain this sort of attention in like their relationship together, or trade between each other. So, as I said, they have little in common, but they do well in terms of trade and also economic growth. So if you look at the size of their economies, that's why they are important. If you look at trade, if you look at the population, military power, and political influences, you will understand how these countries are important. So as some expect even that these countries, or actually they are, but some will expect that these will be bigger than the US, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, and UK combined. So these BRICS 4 countries will be bigger than these countries, and this will reshape the world order that we live in. And as I said, that will cause some shift in power towards the East. And I think that would be the first time we'll see power shift from the West toward the east. So if you look at this, the global position of BRICS, let's see the contribution to the global economy is expanding significantly. They possess more than a quarter of the world's land. They account for nearly half of the world population, and they produce about 14% of global GDP. And I think this out of date, this 14%, that was 2 years ago. So probably that's more than 14% now. I need to look at this number again, but I would imagine it's more than 14%. But anyway, so if even 14% is not a small number, it's not a small contribution to the world economy. So looking at the population, this is how the BRICS population share of the world between from 1989 till 2012. So, well, I added here South Africa, as I said, because some people like to add South Africa to BRICS. And this is in total. So these are grouped together. As you see, they are nearly 40%, 43%, nearly half of the world population. If you look at the GDP share, again, these numbers just need some updating. But if you look till 2012, so as I said, they were 14% of the world economy. As I said, I would imagine that this is much larger now. But even if it is the same, even if it is around 15%, so it's still it's not a small or a trivial contribution. It's a very important contribution to the world economy. Okay, so if we look at this in terms, I think these are more updated figures. So this is till 2016. So what we have here, we have the contribution to growth in comparing rich countries, BRICS, and other emerging markets. So what do you notice here? What do you notice in this graph? So I understand there's a trend. That's fine. Just forget about the trend. If you look at the composition of this growth, so look at the share of rich countries. You will see how the architecture of the global economy is changing, and that's why it's important to understand development and emerging economies. You'll see how the share of the growth. This comes from rich countries. So emerging economies combined, including BRICS, this is how they grow. And this is why we'll go back to the idea of the convergence hypothesis and how this can lead to a power shift. But let's just think of this now. So if this is the contribution toward the world economy growth, so it comes mainly from emerging economies, not rich economies. And this is not sorry, this is new. So this is not something like has been also in the past. Well, in the past, we used to see that how advanced economies are leading the growth. But now, as I said, there's like a structural change in the fabric or the way the global economy is functioning. Now we will see that how the world economy mainly depends on or how emerging economies combined together, BRICS, increasingly becoming important players in the world economy. Okay, so this is a very very important point. Okay, so this is how they work together. As I say, it's based on trade, investment, etc. They actually, even during the financial crisis, and that's another reason why commentators or people argue that BRICS are doing very well. BRICS are actually changing the structure of the world economy in the sense that there will be a power shift toward the east. During the financial crisis, the time that where all advanced economies were actually suffering economically, BRICS countries were growing at nearly 5% rate. So compares to 0.17% or 0.5 in EU, in the European Union and the OECD countries together. So in that time, that difficult time, BRICS countries were doing very well. Okay, so that tells you how they perform in economic terms, even in hard times as well. And again, that's why people think that some people are very optimistic about their position, about the BRICS, the position of BRICS countries, and how this might change the rules of the game. Okay. Okay, so this is in terms of GDP. If we look at this in terms of GDP, well, some people like to look at GDP. So as I said, this was 2 years ago when I wrote these slides. But now this is the latest figures which I got yesterday from the World Bank database. So I saw that China was a few years ago was third in terms of size of GDP. Now they are first. Well, if you look at how big their GDP compared to the US, and then India was fourth, now number 3. Okay, so the third largest economy in terms of its GDP. Russia was 7th, now 6th. Brazil 8th, now it is 7th. I didn't look for South Africa how they're doing, but not sure if they improve their position in terms of the size of GDP or not. But I'm sure about these the other 4 countries, so which I just checked yesterday. So when we look at this, as I said, so we see how well they are doing and how they are becoming every day they are becoming more important in the world economy, and that's why people become more and more interested in studying why BRICS, or how BRICS became an important player in the world economy. Do you have any questions? You don't have questions. Okay. Okay. So, but BRICS are not similar. Even if you go back here, well, India and China probably they're very close to each other. I mean, Russia and Brazil again. So they are not, even in terms of the size, they are not very similar. So BRICS are actually the most important player in BRICS will be China. China, the scale of the economy and the pace of its development outpaced all other BRICS countries. So China is the most important player in BRICS group. So if you think about it, so you see that more than half of the BRICS countries share. That's what China produces, and even its growth rate is much higher than average growth rate in other countries as well. So they are not the same. Even as I said, they have very little in common. They are not very similar, but they developed their own model of international cooperation and international integration through trade and investment, and mainly through trade. But still, China is much different from others, and their contribution to the group in total is probably more than other 3 countries as well. Or even if you include South Africa as well, I would imagine that China is still doing a really good job, and they are, in terms of the size, they are much bigger than the others. But anyway, so that was just a very quick note about one of the countries. But hopefully now you understand what is development economics or economic development, how to measure it, how to understand economic development, whether we should look at GDP only or not. Well, probably we should now know that we shouldn't just look at growth. It's important to look at other social and not just economic factors. You need to look at social and political factors. You need to look at equality or other issues as well. That's why we looked at HDI. Moving to emerging economies, BRICS is a very important example that I want you really to read more about it. What I try to do here in this part of the lecture, just to give you an idea why BRICS is important, why people think that BRICS will be an example that show for the first time how power can be shifted from the from the west to the east, probably for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, and how this might change the rules of the game. So it's very important to see that how their contribution, and to be honest, even if you look at this graph when we show the growth in the world economy, the contribution of emerging markets or emerging economies combined are very, very important now to the world economy compared to, I mean, I'm not trying to undermine what the contribution of rich economies, but if you look at how important emerging economies together and BRICS in particular to the world economy, understand why it is important to learn more about BRICS and how they I probably would understand the argument as well where people suggest that, or they expect that BRICS countries will there will be like a shift in power shift toward BRICS countries, or from the west to the east for the first time. So that's the idea here. So now, we covered economic development. We covered the cover this one. Yeah, so this is the paper I was talking about. Before we move to the next point, probably we'll vote for a break in a minute. But before we do that, again, just going back to this paper, that's why I asked you to read this paper. This paper is about, this is the title, A Future Global Economy to be Built by BRICS. So he's just arguing that the future of the global economy will be determined by these countries together. Okay, so it's a very detailed paper. It looks at the features of each one of these economies, and it highlights of some of the country-specific obstacles as well. So some of the problems related to each one of those that's for countries. That's why I'm inviting you to read this paper. Do you have any questions about economic development? Did you do economic development before? You studied economic development, so you understand economic development is not just growth. Okay, so this is the takeaway message from the first part of the lecture. So if you get this point, then we are good, we're fine. Okay, so economic development is different from just growth. Well, growth is not bad. I don't want people to think that I'm saying, well, growth is not good. Growth is good, but is not enough. So we need to think about other factors as well. So that's why you will see economists today looking at happiness and well-being and other issues. Is not just income. So we're not just studying income today. We study like people satisfaction, well-being, happiness, how happy they are, etc. All these factors are important too. So that was the first part of, or the first point in the lecture. So the second one, hopefully you understand now why BRICS is important as a group. Okay, and when we move to the next point, now we'll see more about the how emerging economies, including BRICS, of course, grow very fast, or relatively faster than developed or advanced economies, and that will make it easier to understand why people think of this power shift globally. Okay, so if you see developing countries growing so much faster compared to developed countries, and if that continues in the future, there will be sort of catch-up effect here. So they will catch up with developed countries, and they might even outperform these countries, and that will lead to closing the gap between developing and developed countries, and that is what we call convergence hypothesis, and that's what we will come to discuss next, if we have a break or not. So as usual, we'll vote for if you're happy to have a break or to carry on. So if you like to have a break, 10 minutes break, see people happy when I say that, please raise your hand. Wow, majority asking for break. Okay, so if you want to carry on, we didn't decide yet, so you can stand up now. I know it's the majority, and it's very clear majority, but you have to wait. So if you want to carry on without break, please raise your hand. 2 people. Okay, you guys, you're not campaigning for your favorable outcome. Anyway, so we'll have a 10-minute breaks, and then I'll see you after the break. Thank you. So hopefully we'll be recording from now, and hopefully we didn't miss much in the first part of the lecture, because I don't know when exactly the server was down. So again, this is just very quickly to put things in context. We started with what is development economics, what is economic development, how to measure it, and why is it important to think about BRICS as a group and emerging countries or emerging economies in general. Now let's talk about the relative gap between developed, advanced, rich economies, and on the other side, emerging and developing economies. So since the Industrial Revolution caused this sort of gap between in income, of course, in terms of GDP and income, between developed or advanced economies and poor economies. But after the Second World War, this divergence, this gap, still there, but at a slower pace. So it remained stable between 1950 and 1990. So what happened after 1990? So before the Second World War, since the Industrial Revolution, there was like a widening gap between developed countries and poor countries. This gap became more stable, relatively more stable between 1950, so it didn't shrink or didn't increase significantly, but there was a gap. Since 1990, this things changed. So growth sped up in emerging economies. They start growing, and also at the end of by the new millennium or the new 21st century, they also less developed economies or less developed countries starting catching up as well. So they starting growing fast as well. So this change happened since 1990. So if you look at this graph, this is per capita GDP growth in advanced economies line, and emerging economies, this the red line, and developing economies, the green line. So this data, if you see this data from 1981 till 2015, so you'll see that how, so the growth rate here, advanced economy was on the top, so they're growing faster. And then since 1990, since this time, then the emerging economies, the red one, start growing faster. Well, still developing is still at a lower pace, but then when we come to 2000, this year here, you will see that, sorry. Okay, so you will see that the both emerging economies, the red line, and developing economies are growing much faster than advanced economies. Okay, so this is the per capita GDP. So since 1981 to from 1981 to 2015. So what's happened here? So if we want to see the long-term trend between in terms of growth between these three groups of countries, you will see how here the long-term trend, as I said, from 1990 starts to diverge. So developing and emerging economies, these top two lines here, they become growing faster compared to developed or advanced economies. So what does that mean? And that's why we wanted to understand the convergence hypothesis. So what we see now, well, of course, advanced economies, they are still important players in the world economy. But if you think about how developing and emerging economies growing, so there is sort of catch-up effect which explain the convergence, or which is known as the convergence hypothesis, because if poor economies or emerging economies grow faster than richer economies, and I think this is something we see here, this is the long trend, long-term trend, and this the GDP growth, at some point then they will close the gap. and that's what it means, the convergence hypothesis. So at some point, because they grow faster, this gap will start shrinking, and then until eventually converge. So developing or emerging economies will catch up with advanced economies. So why is it important to us to understand this? So what is the implication of this? What's the problem with that? So the idea, we are interested in power, yeah? We study international economic policy. Power is important, okay? If convergence hypothesis is true, this might lead to power shift. That's what we've been talking about for the whole lecture, and even the previous week as well. We talked about how important to think of power, how it is exercised in the global economy, but also power shift is important as well. Okay, so if this is true, there might be this sort of shift caused by the developing or emerging economies catching up with advanced economies, closing the gap between both groups of countries. So what does explain this convergence? How did it happen? So you can give many reasons, but I think globalization is one obvious reason. Why? Because we have strengthened trade links and rising FDI. FDI, foreign direct investment, bring technology. So developing countries or emerging countries, they don't have to invent technologies. They just need to welcome foreign investments. And foreign investors will bring technologies with them. So, and that's it, okay? So it's easier to buy technology rather than, or open the door for foreign investors to come with their advanced technologies from developed countries or from rich countries, which is easier than inventing or reinventing the wheel. So try to invent these technologies. Also, another reason that can explain the convergence between emerging and advanced economies could be because of demographic transition. So we've seen slower population growth in emerging economies. At the same time, we've seen aging population in advanced economies. Of course, this will contribute to growth in emerging, or faster growth rate in emerging economies. Of course, investment, which when you look at emerging economies, how they open the door to foreign investment, how they have untapped, or they had untapped investment opportunities with high return, and how these investments injected into these countries contributed toward higher total factor productivity. So it increased productivity by bringing more capital, because these countries lacked capital. They didn't have sufficient, they didn't have enough capital. When you open the door to foreign investment, then you'll bring more capital that will help your labor or your workers to increase their productivity, and eventually total factor productivity, which means productivity of labor and capital combined, will increase as well, will improve as well. Okay, so this could be another reason why we've seen this catching up effect, or why we've seen this gap is getting narrower or is shrinking in terms of growth rates. Because this, again, important to remember, we said growth is not everything. Well, growth is good, it's fine, but it's not the whole story. Growth just show you part of the story, okay? So you can't just argue like, it's difficult to convince people that people in China are much better off than people in the US. We saw that the Chinese economy is much bigger than, or is growing faster than the American economy, and probably is growing faster than any other economy in the world. But again, what does that reflect? Well, growth is good, it's fine, but it's not the whole story, okay? So you need to think of development, not just growth. Anyway, so there's another pattern here. So if you remember, this graph show you the long-term trend. This one show you the short-term cyclical changes. So what does that mean? What does that show us? It shows how interdependent world economies are. Okay, how in the short, even in the short term, how business cycles, which ups and downs in the economy, can travel across borders. So you see how these moving together. Just remember, these are the short-term cyclical fluctuation in economic performance or in GDP growth. Okay, so this show you the long-term trend, but if you focus or if you zoom in that picture to see the short term, you see how interdependent the world economies are. So you see how these are all emerging and developing countries in the red line, and advancing economy in the blue line. So you see how these co-movements, how they are correlated together. Okay, so yes, they grow faster, but they still interdependent. And that this quote is explain the story, so it summarize what everything I just said now. So growth in emerging markets and developing economies is less dependent on advanced economies. Yes, now they're becoming growing more faster, much more faster. But that happened over the long term or the long run. That's what we've seen from the trend. But in the short run, they dance together. So they're moving together. So they are interdependent. Okay. So now let's just look at the story again. Just step back and look at the whole story. So we started with what is economic development. Well, we looked at one example of emerging economies, and what is important to us is power. Okay, power is what we actually want to focus on. Does that mean there is a global shift in power or not? So emerging economies are growing. Well, whether they are developed or not, this is something that you can argue about. So we're not going to discuss this. But again, if you understand the difference between growth and development, then you can make your own judgment whether they are doing enough or not. But what is important to us is power. Okay, and power is important to you because of the coursework. Okay, so. But what is important to me is power, is understanding power. Okay, but let's define power. I think we discussed this last week, the week before, and probably the week before as well. So we've been discussing this over the last 3 weeks. But now let's just put things in a more formal way of discussion, to discuss it. So what is power? Well, I explained it before, is the influence. So if you have influence, you remember the example I gave about your friend, that friend in your group that is very convincing, that he can convince you to go to a certain restaurant or a certain pub or a nightclub, wherever, because you trust him. So influence doesn't have to be forcing you. It could be through convincing you. You trust their taste. Well, they say there's a nice restaurant in that place. You trust them, you go with them. I mean, it's not bad or wrong, it's fine. Yeah, it's just because you are convinced that I trust him, you trust his taste, you tried it before, you liked it, and you follow him. Okay, so in international relations, we have the same thing. So it's not all about hard power, it's not all about military. Okay, there could be values, culture. Okay, could be any other thing. So it doesn't have to be. It could be diplomacy. It doesn't have to be military. So we categorize these. We put them in different groups: hard power, soft power, and smart power. Okay. So the exercise of these will be through the state's behavior, what they do, their action, how they use their resources, and how they design their international policies. So if we look at the first one, hard power, is not difficult to understand. Hard power, well, you can see it everywhere. Okay, so basically it's the use of economic and military means to influence other nations. Well, you want a favorable outcome to you. So this could be exercised in many forms. It could be military threats or economic sanctions. We saw this against Iran. We saw this with how the West is dealing with North Korea, how the West dealt with Russia when they invaded Ukraine. So we saw many examples in this before. Economic sanctions. Okay, it could be also military threats. So this hard power is not difficult to understand. people can see hard power in aid, development aid, and I mean, people can put it that way. Well, we give you how many million or billion of dollars, and then if you don't do what we want, then we just cut this off. Yeah, so we're not gonna pay you. So and that happened. I think I gave you that example before. We had this threat from the U.S. before in Egypt because we receive aid from USA, and then when there are certain outcomes that are not favorable to the USA, also say the first thing is say, well, we're going to cut the aid. So you have to then listen to what they are saying. So some people would consider that as hard power. So it depends on how you understand it. But yeah, it could be hard power. So it's not just military intervention or military threats or economic sanction. It could be also aid as well. So how about soft power? Soft power is the ability to affect others by attraction or persuasion. That's exactly, remember your nice friend. Remember your friend that you trust. You go with them wherever they go, so you don't mind. So you trust them. They are very good at convincing others. You trust their taste, you follow them. It's the same with international relations. So the ability to affect others by attraction, so you don't have to threaten people. You can be nice. And that's why people follow you. Okay? So that could be through values, culture, diplomacy, as I explained. There are three sources of soft power for any country. As I say, it could be culture, so when it is seen attractive by others. You guys here, you celebrate Halloween. Halloween is not, I don't think it's a British festival or anything, it's American. Why you do it? You admire Americans, you like their values, you see they are more attractive, they're nice. Yeah, I mean, you see them, so that's why you follow them, okay? By the way, this is one of the things that I didn't know about the UK before I came to the UK, is the Halloween thing. So I didn't expect that the UK celebrate Halloween, but then when I came, I saw that everyone in the streets dressed in a very strange way. So then they told me this is Halloween. Anyway, so political values. Okay, also foreign policies. When you show yourself as a peacemaker, you're trying to be involved in conflict, trying to solve conflicts, then people would listen to you, or other countries would follow you because you're promoting yourself as a peacemaker, or somebody who's concerned about others, etc. So these are a source of soft power. Okay, but the problem here is soft power on its own is not sufficient. It's not enough. You can't be nice all the time. You have to be tough sometimes. Okay, and that is the idea, and that is the mix between hard power and soft power. What they call the smart power. Smart power is that mix. How can you do that mix? Again, you need to get that mix right. So you don't have to be, or you can't be nice all the time, or you can't be horrible all the time. So you have to get that mix right to achieve your goals. And that's the idea. So the mix or the combination of hard power and soft power known as smart power. Okay? Because smart power is not enough in its own. It has to be mixed with hard power, and both will if you use them in a way that achieve your objective, then it's very smart. So this is like an example. So power depends on whose army wins, but also depends on whose story wins. So a strong narrative is a source of power. Okay, so the idea here is the ability of any actor, or could be a state or government or any group, to combine elements of both hard power and soft power together to become mutually reinforcing, so they actually help you achieving your objectives. So some countries would enjoy political influence that's greater than military and economic weight, their military and economic weight. Again, it could be because they're able to include some good causes in their national interests, like economic aid, peacekeeping, etc. All these nice, good, lovely values that make people or other nations follow you. On the other hand, you could see some countries with hard power, but they are actually, they're not, they undercut their soft power by being horrible all the time. So again, this is another example of soft power. But anyway, so by whatever soft power you use, soft power needs hard power. So you can't just rely on soft power, and that's the bottom line. So let's move to the most important one, which recently coined, which has been talking about since we started this module, is sharp power. So it's a recently coined concept, and the idea here is the deceptive use of information for hostile purposes, meaning that you manipulate ideas, you and political perceptions, and you intervene with the democratic process in usually, or what is happening, or what we see, what we hear in the media is Russia and China are accused by using sharp power. And as I said, there are many reports that came out recently, and if you Google just sharp power, The Economist, you will see at least 5-6 reports just on sharp power, explaining what sharp power is and where the concept came from, and different examples of why the West is accusing, or many countries in the West are accusing Russia and China to be using sharp power in terms of manipulating ideas, perceptions, to affect their nationals to achieve some outcomes, certain outcomes. But the point here, what is important here to understand, is that this sort of manipulation is not new. The idea of sharp power doesn't come from manipulating ideas or deceiving others. It comes from the speed by which this can spread, this information. So during the Cold War, there was always this between the US and the Soviet Union. Okay, so this sort of manipulation, this sort of disinformation exists a long time ago. But what is new, what made people coin it under different sort of power, is how to use Facebook, the social media, how to use the internet to access a wider like population, and how cheap and easy to do that. How easy to do that is very that what makes it very powerful. Okay, it's very easy to do that, and it's very quick, and at very low cost, and it's different from spreading spies, or it's much more cheaper compared to other or the old school way of doing the same thing. But anyway, so please go to the, as I said, please check The Economist. Make sure you read about sharp power, not just sharp power. Make sure you understand different types of power. You need to be able to demonstrate your understanding of these different sort of powers, and different examples of how these sort of power were different types of power were exercised in the global economy. And you need that for your coursework, and as I said before, you need it for the exam. Do you remember what I said in the first lecture? There's a question in the exam on the same topic. Okay, so please study this topic very well. It's not just for your coursework, it's for the exam too. And again, I'm saying it now because you might have forgotten. I've said that since in lecture 1. When we started this module, when I encouraged people to read really carefully about different, and the idea here is not to repeat, by the way, guys, the idea is not repeating what I said in my slides. It's to apply this to different situations, different examples. This is where it comes from, okay? So I don't want to see like, well, you just copy paste from my slides, and well, we've done the coursework, now we understand everything. Please go and show that you've done some reading, that you've done something more than just reading those slides. Okay, so the topic of power and how it is exercised in the global economy is one of like the central concepts in international economic policy, and this is one of the basic and the very important learning outcome in this module. So that's why if you look at the exam, you'll see as I said, this module was taught, this is the 3rd time. Every time there's a question about power. Okay, because this is one of the key messages in this module. It's not to tell you how to think about power. I want you to have your own views on power, how it is exercised in the world economy. Okay, different real world examples of the use of these different sort of power: hard power, soft power, smart power, and now we're talking about sharp power. You just need to think about this and reflect upon them. Okay, do you have any question regarding the assignment or the lecture today, today's lecture? Have you all got your own groups now? Because well, I've except few people who already emailed me, I would imagine that everyone else, well, they emailed me to put them in groups to help them to form their groups. So only 5 people did. So I would imagine that everyone else in this class already had or has their own group, and they start working on the assignments. So please, the deadline for doing that, if you need my help to form your group, is today. So please make sure before the end of my office hours today, because this is when I'm gonna set groups for those who ask it help to form groups for them. Okay, others I would assume that, well, they already have their groups, they started working on the coursework. And as I said, we'll meet again today in the seminar. This is exactly what we discussed today, and then these are the questions we'll discuss in the seminar. So we'll talk more about convergence hypothesis and how this is likely to lead to shifting in power globally. And next lecture we'll talk about politics of trade. Politics of trade is becoming even more important and a very interesting topic given what is happening in the US, what is happening here in the UK and the EU, and whether we're going to be in a custom union or the custom union, all these issues or debates. Please prepare for this lecture. It's becoming more interesting because of what is happening in the global economy. These are the references. Well, if you don't have access to the internet, so you're free to go. See you guys at, is it 5 o'clock? I think so.